Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I will always despise hiking and being in nature. I have never been overly fond of the outdoors, and I am a snob about it, and I am not afraid to admit that truth. I hate being too hot, and I hate being too cold. My friends literally call me Goldilocks because they say everything needs to be just right or I will make a scene. They are absolutely right about that. But hiking is the worst of all activities I have ever been subjected to, and trust me when I tell you I have my reasons. The reasons are burned into my memory like a brand seared into flesh. They wake me in the middle of the night sometimes, and I find myself staring at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat pounding in my ears like a drum. People think I am dramatic when I refuse invitations to camping trips or nature walks. They think I am being difficult or pretentious. They have no idea what I experienced. They have no understanding of the terror that lurks in the wilderness, waiting for someone foolish enough to venture too far from civilization. This is my story, and I am telling it now because I need people to understand that nature is not the peaceful escape that social media influencers want you to believe it is. Nature is indifferent to human suffering. Nature will watch you die without blinking. Back in 2017, I dated this guy named Tyler. I loved him deeply, in that all-consuming way you love someone when you are young and naive. He was 26 years old. This big outdoors type who spent every weekend conquering some new trail or climbing some new peak. It took a lot of convincing, but I eventually opened myself up to his world so I could spend more time with him. I hate to admit this now, but I actually started to enjoy some mild hikes. The type of hikes that real hikers would just laugh at and dismiss as nothing more than walks in the park. These gentle trails were perfect for someone like me. A few hours outside in the fresh air, nothing too intense or demanding, and then I could return home and sleep in my own bed at night. That was the key for me. I always needed to know that my comfortable bed was waiting for me at the end. About a year into our relationship, Tyler begged me to hike this particular trail with him for his birthday. He had been talking about it for months, showing me pictures online, describing the views from the summit. I agreed because, like I said, I was starting to come around to the whole outdoors thing. I was nervous though, deeply nervous, because his birthday fell at the end of October. We ran the serious risk of encountering cold weather, which I absolutely dreaded. He assured me repeatedly that the hike was an easy one, and that the weather forecast looked favorable. He promised me we would be fine, but Tyler was wrong about everything. His birthday arrived on October 29th, and the weather was absolutely nasty. I knew it the moment I woke up that morning and looked out the window. The fog was so thick and oppressive that you could barely see 10 feet in front of your face. It hung in the air like something alive, something waiting. The precipitation was a miserable mixture of wet snow and freezing rain that soaked through every layer of clothing within minutes. I was already miserable before we even started, my teeth chattering, my fingers numb inside my gloves. We started the hike anyway because I was trying to be a good girlfriend. I wanted to make his birthday special, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and go home. I realized a little too late that this was not some easy beginner trail like Tyler had promised. The path grew increasingly narrow and treacherous as we climbed higher. The fog made it impossible to see where we were going, and I had to trust Tyler completely as he led the way. I understood then that he was looking to push me to a new limit, to test what I was capable of, and I was furious with him for deceiving me, but I said nothing. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, trying not to think about how far from the car we were. We were walking on this tight walkway carved into the side of the mountain. The path could not have been more than 2 feet wide, with a sheer rock wall on one side and a steep drop on the other. The wet snow had made everything slippery, and I was moving slowly, carefully placing each step. Then my foot caught on something. A root, maybe, or a rock hidden beneath the slush. I felt my ankle twist, felt my balance shift, and then I was falling. I did not just fall, though. I stumbled badly and tumbled down a steep cliff that seemed to go on forever. I was like a bowling ball careening down a rocky slope, my body slamming against stones and branches and frozen earth. Every impact sent shockwaves of agony through my entire being. When I finally stopped rolling, I was lying on my back at the bottom of what looked like a 30-foot drop. My leg was definitely broken. I knew it immediately because it was bent at an angle that no leg should ever bend. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It radiated from my shin up through my entire body, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I could hear Tyler screaming from above, his voice distant and muffled by the fog. I tried to answer him but could not find my voice at first. Finally, I managed to shout up to him and explain what happened. I remember feeling a desperate relief that I was still alive. He told me to stay put and that he was going to hike back to get help, as if I could have moved anywhere in my condition. The pain was horrible, and it seemed to intensify with every passing minute. Not long after Tyler left, it occurred to me that we were already pretty deep into the hike. We had been walking for over 2 hours before my fall. It was going to take him at least that long to get back to the trailhead, find cell service to call for help, and then somehow guide the rescue team back to my location. I started to cry because the situation seemed utterly impossible. The only movement I made after falling was pulling myself across the rocky ground to a nearby tree, using my arms to drag my useless body through the mud and debris. I propped myself against the trunk and tried to control my breathing. My watch had shattered during the fall, so I had no way of knowing what time it was. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. The fog refused to lift, and due to it being late October, the sun began to set much earlier than it would have in summer months. The temperature dropped rapidly as the light faded. I got so cold that I almost forgot about the pain in my leg. Almost, but not quite. The pain was always there, throbbing and burning, reminding me of my helplessness. If you think this all sounds bad, wait until I tell you how the story gets even worse. Once darkness began to fall, it descended quickly and completely. Within what felt like 30 minutes, it was nearly pitch black at the bottom of that cliff. The fog and the tree canopy above blocked out any light from the moon or stars. I was sitting in absolute darkness, surrounded by sounds I could not identify. The forest was alive with noises, branches creaking, leaves rustling, small animals scurrying through the underbrush. Every sound made my heart race faster. Thankfully, I did have a small flashlight in my jacket pocket that I could shine toward the cliff face if I heard voices. But as time passed, I became increasingly certain that nobody was ever going to come. Maybe Tyler had gotten lost in the fog. Maybe he had fallen too. Maybe he had simply abandoned me. My mind spiraled into dark places as I sat there shivering, my broken leg screaming in agony. The cold had seeped into my bones, and I could no longer feel my fingers or toes. I wondered if this was what dying felt like. I wondered if anyone would ever find my body. While I was sitting there in unspeakable pain, I started to hear something that I desperately hoped was just my imagination playing tricks on me. It sounded like a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. The sound was so deep that I could almost feel it vibrating in my chest. With trembling hands, I turned on my flashlight and pointed it toward the source of the noise. What I saw made my entire body go rigid with pure primal terror. 2 glowing eyes reflected the beam of my flashlight. They were watching me from maybe 20 feet away. I turned off the light immediately and started to sob uncontrollably. It did not matter what kind of animal those eyes belonged to. Whatever creature was out there watching me was most certainly dangerous. The growling continued, clearly getting closer with each passing second. I could feel the footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, pressing into the frozen ground. Even in the complete darkness, I was eventually able to make out the massive shape that had stopped only a few feet away from where I sat helpless against that tree. It was a large black bear, easily 400 pounds, standing so close that I could have reached out and touched its coarse fur. I did not know the rules for bear encounters. I did not know if I should stay perfectly still or if I should scream at the top of my lungs or if I should wave my arms around to make myself appear larger. My mind had gone completely blank with terror. I ultimately decided to just sit there and whimper pathetically like a wounded animal. Because that is exactly what I was. I remember accepting death in that moment. I was already in so much agony from my broken leg, and now this enormous predator had found me. The bear moved closer until I could feel its hot breath on my cheek. The smell was overwhelming. It was the smell of rotting meat and damp fur and something else, something ancient and wild that my civilized mind could not process. When it growled again, the sound rumbled through my entire body. I kept my eyes squeezed shut as tightly as possible, waiting for teeth or claws to tear into my flesh. I prayed to God, begging for mercy, making promises I knew I would never keep if I somehow survived. People talk about scary experiences all the time. They describe haunted houses and horror movies and close calls in traffic. But let me tell you something with absolute certainty. Almost nothing in this world can compare to the terror of being trapped at the bottom of a cliff at night with a shattered leg and a black bear standing over you, its breath hot on your face, deciding whether you are worth eating. The bear stood there for what felt like several lifetimes. The growling eventually subsided into heavy breathing. And then, inexplicably, the bear sat down right next to me. I could feel its massive body pressing against my side, could feel its rib cage expanding and contracting with each breath. I tried desperately to imagine that it was just a giant dog seeking warmth, but the illusion would not hold. I knew what was beside me. I knew how easily it could end my life. Then, after an eternity of waiting, the bear simply stood up and walked away. I heard its heavy footsteps receding into the darkness, crashing through the underbrush until the sound faded into nothing. I finally allowed myself to breathe, great gasping sobs of relief shaking my broken body. Not long after the bear disappeared, I heard faint voices coming from the top of the cliff. I started shining my flashlight toward the rock wall, waving it back and forth frantically. The rescue team had gone slightly past my location, but they doubled back when they saw my light. They shone powerful floodlights down into the ravine, and I have never been so grateful to see anything in my entire life. 2 rescue workers rappelled down the cliff face, and it was almost like something out of a movie. The next several hours were excruciating. They put my leg into a splint, fashioned a makeshift stretcher, and then used a pulley system to lift me up the cliffside. Every movement sent waves of agony through my body. I screamed until my voice gave out. I eventually made it out of those woods and to a hospital, where they confirmed the compound fracture in my leg. I required surgery and months of physical therapy. I broke up with Tyler before I was even discharged. I decided in that hospital bed that I was completely and permanently finished with the outdoors. I had my brush with death, and I survived by nothing more than luck or divine intervention. I do not know why that bear chose to spare me. Maybe it had already eaten. Maybe it sensed that I was already dying. Maybe it simply did not see me as worth the effort. I am grateful every single day that I am alive to tell this story and to warn you firsthand. If you do not think you are capable of completing a certain hike, know your limitations and back out. The wilderness does not care about your birthday plans or your relationship goals. It will break you without hesitation. You may not be as lucky as I was. My name is Waya Kanuna, and I've been walking these mountain trails longer than most people have been breathing. 7 generations of my Cherokee ancestors have called these ancient peaks home, and their voices still whisper through the wind-bent pines when the moon is dark and the forest holds its breath. As a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains, I've seen things that would make city folk pack up their camping gear and never look back. Bears that walk upright in the moonlight, trees that bleed sap the color of old blood, shadows that move independently of their owners. But nothing prepared me for what started happening 3 weeks ago, when the October moon began to turn red and the Kitawa, the ancient ones my grandmother spoke of in hushed tones, began to stir. It was a Tuesday when I first noticed the silence. I'd been patrolling the Mingus Creek Trail, checking on some overnight campers who'd registered for backcountry permits, when I realized I hadn't heard a single bird call in over an hour. The forest felt hollow, like the inside of a drum skin stretched too tight. Even my boots on the packed earth seemed muffled, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. My radio crackled to life, startling me from thoughts that had begun to drift toward the old stories my great-grandmother used to tell. Stories about creatures that existed in the spaces between worlds, neither fully animal nor spirit, but something far more dangerous than either. "Well, this is dispatch. We've got a situation developing. Over." I keyed the mic clipped to my shoulder. "Go ahead, Sarah. We've got reports of 3 hikers overdue from the Ramsey Cascades Trail. Family of 3, Michael and Jennifer Torres, plus their daughter Emma, age 16. They were supposed to check in yesterday evening but never showed. Their car is still at the trailhead." My gut tightened. The Ramsey Cascades Trail wasn't particularly dangerous, but it wound deep into some of the most remote sections of the park. If someone got hurt up there, or if they wandered off the marked path. Copy that. I'm about 2 hours out from the trailhead. Have you contacted the state SR team? Already on standby. But Waya. Sarah's voice carried an edge I'd rarely heard from our veteran dispatcher. There's something else. We've had 7 other reports in the past week of people hearing sounds. Large animal sounds, coming from that general area. I stopped walking. In Cherokee tradition, we have a word NVHI-OY that roughly translates to the deer's warning. It's that prickle you get at the base of your skull when something in the forest is watching you, something that shouldn't be there. What kind of sound, Sarah? Static filled the channel for a moment before she responded. Howling. But not wolves. We both know there haven't been wolves in these mountains for decades. And not coyotes either. Something bigger. Deeper. One witness described it as sounding like a cross between a bear and a man screaming. The Kitawa. The word appeared in my mind unbidden, carrying with it the weight of ancestral memory. My great-grandmother had warned me about them when I was just 7 years old, after I'd come home claiming to have seen a big hairy man watching me from the tree line behind our house. They are the guardians of the deep places, she had whispered, her weathered hands gripping mine with surprising strength. But they are not kind guardians, Tsalagi. They protect the mountains by making sure some people never leave them. I shook off the memory and focused on the immediate problem. 3 people were missing, possibly lost and injured in terrain that could kill you in a dozen different ways even without supernatural intervention. I'm heading to the trailhead now, I told Sarah. If I don't check in every hour on the hour, send the cavalry. Copy that. And Waya, be careful up there. I've got a bad feeling about this one. The drive to the Ramsey Cascades trailhead took me through some of the most beautiful country in Tennessee, but I barely noticed the riot of autumn colors painting the mountainsides. My mind kept drifting to the stories passed down through my family, stories that weren't supposed to be just stories. The Cherokee have always known these mountains held more than just trees and wildlife. We called them the Kitawa, long before white settlers arrived with their own legends of wild men and Sasquatch. But where modern cryptozoologists spoke of undiscovered primates or evolutionary throwbacks, my ancestors understood something far more complex and terrifying. The Kitawa weren't just animals. They were threshold guardians, beings that existed at the boundary between the world of men and the world of spirits. They were connected to the mountains themselves, to the deep places where the earth's bones lay exposed, and the old magic still ran strong in hidden streams. And according to the stories, they were not happy about the increasing number of humans trampling through their domain. I pulled into the gravel parking area at the trailhead, and immediately spotted the Torres family's blue Honda Civic, sitting alone under the weak afternoon sun. A fine layer of dew covered the windshield despite the day's warmth. It had been there at least 24 hours. As I gathered my gear from the Ranger truck, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. Scratches in the bark of a massive oak tree that stood at the trail's entrance. Deep gouges, at least 8 feet off the ground, too high and too widely spaced to have been made by a bear. The scratches were fresh. Sap still wept from the deepest wounds. I shouldered my pack, checked my radio, and started up the trail. The silence that had unnerved me earlier seemed even more pronounced here. No squirrels chattering in the trees. No insects buzzing in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the mountain itself was listening. The first mile of the Ramsey Cascades Trail follows Ramsey Prong, a clear mountain stream that normally would have been alive with the sound of rushing water. Today, even the creek seemed subdued, its voice reduced to a whisper over the moss-covered stones. I found their first campsite about 2 miles in, where the trail crosses the creek on a wooden bridge. The Torres family had spent at least one night here. I could see the flattened area where their tent had been pitched, the blackened stones of a small fire ring, and a few overlooked pieces of trash that I bagged automatically. But something was wrong with the scene. The tent site was too clean, too precisely arranged. It looked less like a family had camped here and more like someone had arranged props on a stage set. And there were tracks in the soft earth near the creek. Not human tracks, but something else. Something with feet nearly 18 inches long and toes that ended in what looked like claws. I took photos with my camera and tried to get measurements. But every time I knelt down to examine the prints more closely, that ancestral warning system started screaming. The NV-Tau-A Awi was so strong I could taste it, metallic and sharp at the back of my throat. That's when I heard it for the first time. The sound came from somewhere upstream, echoing off the canyon walls until it was impossible to pinpoint its origin. It started low, almost below the range of human hearing, then built to a howl that seemed to contain all the loneliness and fury of the wild places. It was the sound Sarah had described. Part bear, part human scream, but with an intelligence behind it that made every primitive instinct I possessed start clamoring for me to run. Instead, I keyed my radio with shaking fingers. Dispatch. This is Waya. I'm at the first creek crossing on Ramsey Cascades. I found evidence the Torres family camped here, but they've moved on. I'm continuing upstream. Copy, Wea. Everything okay? You sound a little tense. I looked around at the too quiet forest, at the impossible tracks in the mud, at the scratch marks that were beginning to appear on more and more trees as I moved deeper into the mountains. Just peachy, Sarah. Just peachy. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, especially when you're not sure who or what might be listening. The second mile of trail led me steadily upward, following Ramsey Prong as it carved its way through increasingly narrow gorges. The canopy overhead grew thicker, filtering the afternoon sunlight into a greenish twilight that made everything look underwater. My grandmother would have called this Nightland, the place where the normal rules of the world start to break down. I found their second campsite just as the trail began its final steep ascent toward the falls. This one told a different story than the first. The Torres family had left in a hurry. Their tent was gone, but they'd left behind a scattered pile of gear that no experienced hiker would have abandoned willingly. A sleeping bag, still damp with morning dew, a camp stove with a half-full propane canister. Most telling of all, a cell phone with a cracked screen, lying face down in the leaves as if it had been dropped while running. I picked up the phone carefully, wrapping it in an evidence bag from my pack. The last call had been attempted at 11:47 p.m. the previous night, a 911 call that had never gone through. These mountains were notorious dead zones for cell service, but people always tried anyway when they got desperate enough. What had made the Torres family desperate at 11:47 last night? The answer lay in the trees surrounding their abandoned campsite. More scratch marks, these ones fresher and more violent than what I'd seen earlier. Some of the gouges went completely through the bark into the white wood beneath. A few of the smaller saplings had been snapped in half, as if something enormous had simply walked through them without bothering to go around. But it was the smell that really got to me. Every Cherokee child learns to identify the musk of different animals. Bear, deer, wild boar, even the occasional mountain lion that wanders down from the high peaks. This smell was like all of them combined and amplified, with an underlying note of something else, something that reminded me of wet earth and old graves, and the metallic tang of fear sweat. I was photographing the broken trees when I heard voices. Human voices, calling out from somewhere upstream. My radio crackled with renewed hope. Maybe the Torres family was okay after all. Maybe they'd just gotten spooked and moved to a different campsite. Maybe this would turn out to be nothing more than a routine rescue of some city folks who'd gotten in over their heads. I followed the voices up the increasingly steep trail, my boots slipping on wet leaves and loose stones. The sound of Ramsey Falls grew louder as I climbed, a constant roar that would have masked any other sounds in the forest. But the voices kept calling, always just ahead of me, always just around the next bend. It took me 20 minutes to realize they weren't human voices at all. The sounds were too rhythmic, too perfectly spaced. And there was something wrong with the words themselves. They had the cadence of human speech, but the sounds were just slightly off, like someone with a broken jaw trying to form consonants. Help us. Please. Help. The voice drifted down from somewhere above me, near the falls themselves. But when I stopped walking, the voice stopped too. When I started again, it resumed, always maintaining the same distance, always staying just out of sight. My great-grandmother had told me about this too. Kelowna Ialiski, she called them, the Raven Mockers. Spirits that could imitate human voices to lure the unwary into danger. But this felt different, more immediate and physical than any ghost story. This felt like something was playing with me. I reached the base of Ramsey Falls just as the sun disappeared behind the western ridgeline. The waterfall itself was spectacular, a 100-foot cascade that threw spray and mist across a natural amphitheater of moss-covered boulders. Under normal circumstances, it would have been one of the most beautiful places in the park. Today, it felt like a trap. The Torres family had been here. I found more evidence scattered around the base of the falls. A water bottle with Emma written on the side in purple marker, a trail map with a route marked in red ink, and something that made my blood run cold, a child's sneaker, size 8, with what looked like claw marks raked across the leather. But no bodies, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Just that impossible smell growing stronger, and the growing certainty that I was being watched from the shadows between the trees. I made my hourly check-in with dispatch, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported my findings. Sarah's concern came through clearly over the radio static. Wea, I think you should wait for the SR team before going any further. We've had 2 more reports of strange sounds in that area just since you've been out there. Negative, dispatch. If the Torres family is injured and stranded up here, every hour could make the difference. I'm going to follow their trail as far as I can before dark. Copy that, but be careful. And Waya, if you see anything unusual, anything at all, you get out of there immediately. That's an order from the chief. Unusual, if she only knew. The trail beyond Ramsey Falls was barely a trail at all, more of a game path that wound through increasingly dense forest toward the high peaks. This was wilderness in the truest sense, country that hadn't seen regular human traffic since the Cherokee removal in the 1830s. Country where my ancestors had hidden in caves and hollow trees rather than be forced west on the Trail of Tears. Country where the old powers still held sway. I'd been following faint boot prints for about half an hour when I realized I wasn't alone on the path. Something was keeping pace with me, staying in the trees about 50 yards to my left. I could hear it moving through the undergrowth, heavy footsteps that didn't quite match the rhythm of any 4-legged animal I knew. Every time I stopped to listen, the sounds stopped too. Every time I started walking again, they resumed. The smart thing would have been to turn around and head back to the truck. Wait for backup. Wait for the SAR team with their dogs and their high-tech equipment and their sheer numbers. Come back in the morning when I could see what I was dealing with. But 3 people were missing, including a 16-year-old girl, and something in the deepest part of my Cherokee soul was telling me that if I left now, I'd never see them alive again. The trail eventually led to a small clearing where ancient oaks formed a natural circle around a spring-fed pool. This place had significance. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to hum with invisible energy. My ancestors would have recognized this as a sacred site, a place where the veil between worlds grew thin. The Torres family had found this place too. Their gear was scattered around the edge of the clearing like the remnants of some desperate last stand. Torn sleeping bags, scattered food containers, and in the center of it all, a message scratched into the soft earth with a stick. It's hunting us. Going to High Cave. Tell our families we love them. High Cave. I knew the place. A limestone cavern about 2 miles further up the mountain, accessible only by a treacherous climb up exposed rock faces. It wasn't marked on any park maps, and most rangers avoided it because of the unstable geology and the difficulty of any potential rescue operations. If the Torres family had retreated there, they were either very smart or very desperate. The cave would provide shelter and a defensive position, but it was also a trap. There was only one way in or out. I was studying the message, trying to decide on my next move, when the thing that had been following me finally revealed itself. The first thing I noticed was the smell, that overwhelming musk I'd been tracking all afternoon, now so strong it made my eyes water. Then the trees on the far side of the clearing began to shake, as if something massive was pushing through them without regard for the branches that whipped at its passage. When it stepped into the clearing, I finally understood why my ancestors had whispered about the Kitawa in voices full of respect and fear. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the fading sunlight. Its shoulders were broader than any human's, its arms longer than they should have been, ending in hands that were too large and tipped with claws that gleamed like polished obsidian. But it was the face that truly terrified me. Almost human, but elongated and brutal, with intelligence burning in eyes that reflected the last light like a wolf's. We stared at each other across the sacred clearing for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. In that eternal moment, I understood that this wasn't just some unknown species of primate or evolutionary throwback. This was something far older and far more dangerous. A guardian that had been tolerating human intrusion into its domain for decades but had finally reached the limits of its patience. The creature, I couldn't think of it as anything else, tilted its massive head and opened its mouth. When it spoke, it used the voice I'd been following up the mountain, the perfect imitation of a human in distress. Help us, please help. But now I could see the intelligence behind the mimicry, the cruel amusement in those 2 bright eyes. It had been leading me here all along, drawing me deeper into the wilderness, further from any hope of backup or rescue. The question was, why? The answer came to me with the cold certainty of ancestral knowledge passed down through generations of Cherokee, who had learned to survive in these mountains by respecting the things that lived in the deep places. The Torres family wasn't the prey. I was. The Kituwa and I faced each other across the sacred clearing as darkness settled over the mountains like a suffocating blanket. In the dying light, its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was utterly alien and terrifyingly familiar at the same time. This was no simple beast driven by hunger or territorial instinct. This was something that understood strategy, patience, and the particular vulnerability of humans who found themselves alone in the wilderness. My hand moved slowly toward the radio clipped to my shoulder, but the creature's head tilted in what might have been amusement. When it spoke again, it used my own voice perfectly replicated down to the slight Cherokee accent I'd never quite lost. "Dispatch. This is Waya. Everything's fine up here. Just going to check one more location before heading back." The mimicry was so perfect that for a moment I wondered if I'd actually said the words. But my radio was silent, and I could feel the cold weight of understanding settle in my stomach. The thing had been listening to my communications all afternoon, learning, studying, preparing. Sarah's voice crackled through the static. "Copy that, Waya. See you back at the station." The Kituwa's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that belonged in the skull of something that had been designed specifically for killing. It had just bought itself hours of uninterrupted hunting time by convincing dispatch that everything was normal. I keyed my radio, hoping to correct the deception, but nothing happened. The display was dark, the battery somehow drained despite being fully charged when I'd started the hike. The creature's smile widened, as if it had been waiting for me to discover this particular trap. "The old stories," I whispered, more to myself than to the massive figure across the clearing. "You're the reason the Cherokee stayed away from certain parts of these mountains." The Kituwa nodded once, a disturbingly human gesture from something that should never have understood human language. When it spoke again, it used the voice of an elderly Cherokee woman, my great-grandmother's voice, speaking in the Cherokee language I'd learned at her knee. "Ajiyutsa, Salagi, Hayanasgina Dohi." "Little one, Cherokee. This land is sacred." Hearing my great-grandmother's voice coming from that nightmarish face was almost more than I could bear, but it also awakened something deeper than fear, a connection to my ancestors who had faced similar guardians and learned to coexist with them through respect, caution, and the occasional necessary sacrifice. "Azda, Kituwa," I replied in Cherokee, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tigageyu nihi, Nazgina jalagi gese." "Good, Kituwa. I understand you. The people are sacred too." The creature studied me for a long moment, and I could see it processing this response. Most of the humans it encountered probably couldn't even recognize what it was, much less address it in the old language. But I was Cherokee, descended from people who had walked these mountains for thousands of years before the first Europeans set foot in the New World. That gave me leverage, but it also made me more dangerous in its eyes. The Kituwa stepped back into the tree line, melting into the shadows with impossible grace for something so large, but I could still feel its presence, circling the clearing like a wolf testing the defenses of its prey. The hunt had begun in earnest now, but at least it was a hunt with rules that both sides understood. I needed to reach the Torres family before this thing decided they were no longer useful as bait. The climb to the high cave was treacherous under the best of circumstances. In the dark, following a nearly invisible game trail up loose scree and exposed rock faces, it was borderline suicidal. But I'd made this climb before during my early years as a ranger, when I was still young enough to think that knowing every square mile of my assigned territory was more important than staying alive to protect it. The Kituwa followed me, always staying just at the edge of my perception. Sometimes I caught glimpses of it moving through the trees below me, a darker shadow against the darkness. Other times I heard the scrape of claws on stone as it climbed parallel to my route, using paths that no human could have managed. It was playing with me, I realized. The creature could have ended this hunt at any point. I'd seen how fast it could move, had felt the intelligence behind those burning eyes, but it wanted something more than just another victim. It wanted me to understand exactly how helpless I was, how completely I was at its mercy in this environment that it knew better than any human ever could. The mouth of the high cave was a black gash in the limestone cliff face, barely visible even with my heavy-duty flashlight. But as I approached the narrow ledge that led to the entrance, I could see a faint glow coming from within. The Torres family had managed to get a fire going, which meant they were still alive. "Hello?" I called softly as I reached the cave mouth. "Mr. and Mrs. Torres? Emma? This is Park Ranger Waya Kanuna. I'm here to help." The response was immediate. A teenage girl's voice, high with relief and terror. "Oh God, thank God someone found us. Please, you have to help us. There's something out there, something that's been hunting us for 2 days." I played my flashlight beam into the cave and saw them huddled around a small fire built from broken branches and torn pieces of their gear. Michael Torres, a man in his 40s with the soft look of someone who spent most of his time behind a desk, clutched a hiking pole like a weapon. His wife Jennifer was bandaging what looked like claw marks on her left arm, while their daughter Emma pressed herself against the back wall of the cave as if she could somehow disappear into the stone. "Are any of you seriously injured?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Just scratches," Michael replied, though his voice shook with exhaustion. "It's been God, I don't even know how to describe it. Following us, hurting us, like it's some kind of game. Playing with us," Jennifer added, her voice barely above a whisper. "It could have killed us a dozen times, but it just keeps watching, waiting." I knew exactly what they meant, but there was no point in terrifying them further by confirming their worst fears. Instead, I focused on the immediate problem of getting 3 city people down a dangerous mountain trail in complete darkness while being stalked by something that could see in the dark and knew these mountains better than I did. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," I said, unslinging my pack and starting to distribute emergency supplies. "We're going to wait until first light. Then we're going to move fast and quiet back down to the trail. I've got the route memorized, and I've called for backup." The lie came easily, but Emma wasn't fooled. She was young enough to pick up on the subtle signs that adults often missed. The way my hands shook slightly as I handed out energy bars. The way I kept glancing toward the cave mouth. The tension in my voice despite my attempt to sound confident. "You're scared too," she said quietly. "You know what it is, don't you?" I looked into her eyes and saw an intelligence that reminded me of myself at her age. When I'd first started learning the old stories from my great-grandmother. Some truths couldn't be hidden, especially from the young. "Yes," I admitted. "I know what it is. And yes, I'm scared. But fear isn't always a bad thing, Emma. Sometimes it's the thing that keeps you alive long enough to find a way out." That's when the Kitawa announced its presence with a sound that turned my blood to ice water. The howl started somewhere below us on the mountainside and built to a crescendo that seemed to come from every direction at once. It was the sound of something ancient and furious, something that had been patient far longer than it wanted to be. The echoes bounced off the canyon walls until the entire mountain seemed to be screaming. When the sound finally faded, the silence that followed was even worse. "What do we do?" Michael whispered, his makeshift weapon trembling in his hands. Before I could answer, Emma pointed toward the cave mouth with a shaking finger. "Look!" 2 burning eyes stared at us from just beyond the reach of our firelight. The Kitawa had climbed the cliff face with the silent efficiency of something that had evolved specifically for this kind of terrain. Now it crouched at the entrance to our shelter, blocking the only way out. When it spoke, it used Emma's voice, her exact words from just moments before, but twisted with malicious amusement. "You know what it is, don't you?" Then it settled down to wait, like a cat outside a mouse hole, supremely confident that its prey had nowhere left to run. The siege had begun. The fire in the cave burned lower as the hours crawled past midnight, and with it our hopes of surviving until dawn. The Kitawa had not moved from its position at the cave mouth, squatting with inhuman patience while its eyes reflected our dwindling flames. Occasionally it would speak, using one of our voices to repeat something we'd said earlier, as if it was cataloging our words for some purpose I didn't want to contemplate. Jennifer Torres had fallen into an exhausted sleep against the cave wall, her injured arm cradled against her chest. Michael sat beside her, still clutching his hiking pole, but I could see the defeat creeping into his eyes. Only Emma remained alert, watching the creature with the kind of focused attention that reminded me why Cherokee children had once been taught to observe the forest with such intensity. "It's waiting for something," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it over the crackle of burning wood. She was right. The Kitawa could have rushed us at any point during the long night. The cave wasn't deep enough to provide any real protection, and we had no weapons that could stop something of its size and strength. But it remained at the threshold, like something held back by rules we didn't understand. That's when I remembered the most important lesson my great-grandmother had taught me about the old spirits. They were bound by the same laws that governed all interactions between the Cherokee and the forces of nature. Respect had to be shown, prices had to be paid, and sometimes challenges had to be answered. I stood up slowly, my joints creaking from hours of sitting on cold stone. The Kiowa's head tilted as it watched me approach the cave mouth, but it didn't move to attack. "You want something?" I said in Cherokee, keeping my voice steady and formal. "Jivaj yue nahi. Henabaz gina jalagiosta ayelian vidola. You know me. This sacred land needs good Cherokee blood, dear." The creature's eyes flared brighter, and when it responded, it used the voice of my great-grandmother again, speaking words I remembered from a ceremony I'd witnessed as a child.
Asgaya
Kiatoa, Dodolan Vigasi, Nazgina Elohi Golf Kordian. I know you. The man Kiatoa must choose also. Sacred spirit balance blood. A choice. A test. The old spirits had always demanded that humans prove their worth through trials that tested not just courage but wisdom and sacrifice. I was being offered the chance to face the Kiowa according to the ancient laws, but the price of failure would be death for all of us. "What kind of choice?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. The Kiowa gestured with one massive clawed hand toward the Torres family, then toward itself, then toward me. The meaning was clear. 1 life in exchange for 3. The guardian of these mountains would accept the old bargain, but it would not be cheated of blood entirely. Michael had been listening to our exchange without understanding the words, but the tone was unmistakable. "What's it saying?" he whispered urgently. I looked back at the family huddled in the dying firelight. A man who worked in insurance, a woman who taught elementary school, a teenager who probably wanted nothing more than to go home and complain about her parents to her friends. Normal people who had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding through nothing more than bad luck and a desire to see one of Tennessee's most beautiful waterfalls. "It's offering us a way out," I said quietly. The truth was more complex than that, but some truths were too heavy to share with people who were already carrying more terror than they could handle. What the Kiowa was actually offering was a return to the old ways, when Cherokee warriors would voluntarily enter the Nightland to face the guardians of sacred places. Sometimes they returned with wisdom and power, sometimes they didn't return at all. But their sacrifice ensured that their people could continue to live in harmony with the forces that ruled the deep mountains. "All of us?" Emma asked, and I could see in her eyes that she understood more than her parents realized. "Not all of us," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "Just me." "No." Michael stood up, his hiking pole clattering against the stone. "Absolutely not. You're not sacrificing yourself for us. There has to be another way." I appreciated his courage, but he didn't understand what we were dealing with. The Kiowa wasn't just some aggressive animal that could be scared off with noise and fire. It was a force of nature, as much a part of these mountains as the stone and the trees and the hidden springs. Fighting it on its own ground was like trying to fight an avalanche with your bare hands. But accepting its challenge according to the old rules, that might give us a chance. "There is another way," I said, turning back to face the creature. "Asgaya usdi agyutsa, galvquidiu dodolan figese, asquaninim viatsila gese. Young man, little one, blood choose you also, fight bloodfire also." The Kiowa's eyes flared even brighter, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I heard something like approval in its voice. "Ozda, galvquodi nigigohi, nivhi atsila usdi gese. Good. Blood we fight. Bloodfire small also. A trial by combat, but with conditions that both sides could accept. If I could hold my own against the Guardian for the duration of one ritual challenge from now until the first light of dawn touched the mountain peaks, then it would allow all of us to leave safely. If I failed, the price would be my life, but the Torres family would still be permitted to go. It was the best deal I was going to get. "What are you saying to it?" Jennifer asked, fully awake now and watching our exchange with growing alarm. "I'm buying us passage home," I replied, then began stripping off my ranger uniform and equipment. If I was going to face the Kiowa according to Cherokee tradition, I needed to do it properly. The creature watched with what might have been amusement as I reduced myself to just pants and boots. then produced a small pouch I always carried, a medicine bundle my great-grandmother had given me when I first became a ranger. Inside were sacred tobacco, a piece of flint from the old Cherokee homeland, and a small braid of sweetgrass that had been blessed in ceremonies I was too young to fully understand. I scattered the tobacco at the cave mouth while speaking the old words of protection and balance. The Kitawa nodded once, a gesture of respect that would have been reassuring if it hadn't come from something with claws like obsidian daggers. Then it rose to its full height, stepped back from the cave entrance, and beckoned me to follow. The ritual ground it chose was a flat area of exposed granite about 50 yards from the cave, lit by the last quarter moon, and surrounded by ancient oaks that seemed to lean inward like spectators in some primordial arena. The Kitawa moved to the center of the space and waited, its massive form silhouetted against the star-filled sky. I joined it in the circle, feeling the cold mountain air raise goosebumps on my exposed skin. This close, the creature's musk was almost overwhelming, but beneath it I could smell something else. The clean scent of deep earth and old-growth forests, the smell of wildness itself. Galvquodi dodolenvi yigi, I said formally. Blood choose you now. The Kitawa nodded once more, then launched itself at me with speed that should have been impossible for something so large. I threw myself sideways, feeling claws rake across my ribs as I rolled away from its initial attack. Hot blood ran down my side. But the wounds weren't deep. The creature was still following the rules of the ritual, testing rather than trying to kill outright. We circled each other in the moonlight, predator and prey locked in a dance that was older than written history. The Kitawa moved with fluid grace, always staying just outside my reach while looking for openings in my defense. I had speed and desperation on my side, but it had size, strength, and the home field advantage. The first exchange taught me that I couldn't win through direct confrontation. When I tried to close distance and grapple, the creature simply picked me up and threw me across the granite clearing like I weighed nothing. I hit the stone hard enough to see stars, but managed to roll away before its claws could pin me down. The second exchange taught me that I couldn't outrun it either. My attempt to use the trees for cover ended when the Kitawa simply knocked down a 10-inch oak to get at me, sending me scrambling for new shelter with my ears ringing from the crash. But the third exchange taught me something more valuable. The creature was testing me according to Cherokee concepts of courage and wisdom, not just trying to prove its physical dominance. When I stopped running and started using traditional wrestling techniques my grandfather had taught me, holds and throws that worked by redirecting an opponent's strength rather than opposing it directly, the Kitawa's attacks became more measured, more ritualistic. We were no longer predator and prey. We were participants in a ceremony that connected us both to powers older than either of our species. The fight continued, as the moon tracked across the sky and the stars wheeled overhead. I took more cuts and bruises than I could count, but the Kitawa was careful never to inflict wounds that would be permanently crippling. This was a test of endurance and will, not a battle to the death. As the first pale hint of dawn began to touch the eastern peaks, both of us were breathing hard and streaked with blood. Mine from the creature's claws. It's from the few lucky shots I'd managed to land with the piece of flint from my medicine bundle. The Kitawa stepped back to the center of the ritual circle and raised its massive head to taste the changing air. When it looked at me again, there was something new in its burning eyes. Not friendship exactly, but recognition. Acknowledgement of an opponent who had earned respect through courage and perseverance. Azda Asgaya, it said in my great-grandmother's voice. Galvquodi saku nasgunyeli. Jalagienvi dohiayeli gese. Good man. Blood enough have been. Cherokee bloodland come also. Then it turned and melted back into the forest as silently as it had first appeared, leaving me alone in the ritual circle with the dawn light painting the granite red and gold. I made my way back to the cave on unsteady legs where the Torres family waited with expressions of amazed relief. The ordeal was over. The ancient price had been paid in blood and courage, if not in death, and we were all free to return to the world of paved roads and cell phone towers and other humans who would never believe what we had experienced in the deep mountains. But as we made our careful way down the treacherous trail toward the valley in safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that this had been more than just a rescue mission gone wrong. The Kitawa hadn't been hunting the Torres family at random. It had been waiting for someone like me, someone who could speak its language and understand the old laws. The guardians of the sacred places were still active in these ancient mountains, still testing the humans who ventured too far into their domain. And sometimes, just sometimes, they found someone worthy of carrying their secrets back to the modern world. My radio crackled to life as we reached the main trail, Sarah's voice sharp with concern. "Waya, are you there? We lost contact with you hours ago." "I'm here, dispatch," I replied, looking back once toward the high peaks where the Kitawa still kept its eternal vigil. "I've got the Torres family safe, and we're heading home." "Copy that. What happened up there?" I thought about trying to explain the truth. The ancient guardian, the ritual combat, the prices that still had to be paid in blood for safe passage through the Nightland. But some stories were too important to tell to people who wouldn't understand their true meaning. "Just got a little turned around in the dark," I said instead. "Nothing we couldn't handle." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but it was a necessary lie. The old ways required discretion, required that certain truths be shared only with those who had proven themselves ready to carry such knowledge. But I made a mental note to have a long conversation with the tribal elders when I got back to town. The Kitawa had made it clear that the balance between the modern world and the ancient powers was shifting, and the Cherokee people needed to be prepared for what was coming. Some guardians were no longer content to remain hidden in the deep places. Some guardians were ready to remind the world that there were still powers older and more dangerous than anything humanity had learned to control. And I had been chosen to carry that message back to my people, written in scars and sealed with blood under the ancient moon. Of all the traditions Dad and I shared, the annual fishing trip was the one that mattered most. After Mom died when I was 12, it became our sacred ritual, a silent agreement that for 1 week each year, we'd leave the city behind and just exist together. Usually that meant loading up the beat-up Ford Ranger and driving down to the Russian River ferry, fighting for a spot on the crowded bank with dozens of other fishermen, their lines tangling in the current, their voices carrying across the water. But this year was different. For my 17th birthday, a milestone that felt more like a countdown to an uncertain future than a celebration, Dad had surprised me. He'd saved for months, maybe longer, working double shifts at the rail yard. He'd booked us a fly-in cabin on the upper Kenai River, deep in the wildlife refuge where roads didn't reach, and cell towers were a fantasy. No crowds, no noise, no connection to the world we were leaving behind. Just us, a remote log cabin, and one of Alaska's most legendary salmon rivers. The morning we left Anchorage, the city was locked under its typical September gray. Rain drummed against the windshield as we drove to Lake Hood, the float plane base where our pilot waited. The de Havilland Beaver sat tied to the dock, its red and white paint slightly faded, its pontoons riding low in the water. The pilot, a weathered man in his 60s who introduced himself only as Dutch, loaded our gear with practiced efficiency. 2 rods, tackle boxes, waders, a cooler packed with food for the week, and our duffel bags stuffed with wool socks and thermal layers. "Weather's supposed to hold," Dutch said, his voice gravelly from what I guessed were decades of cigarettes and cold air. "But up there supposed to doesn't mean much. You got everything you need?" Dad nodded, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder, a gesture that had become his way of saying things he couldn't put into words. The takeoff was smooth despite the chop on the lake. The Beaver's engine roared. The pontoon skipped across the water's surface, and then we were airborne, banking east toward the mountains. As we climbed, Anchorage fell away below us, becoming a grid of streets and buildings that quickly disappeared beneath the low cloud cover. When we broke through the clouds, the world transformed. The Kenai National Wildlife Refuge spread out beneath us like a living map, an endless expanse of boreal forest. The spruce and birch forming a wrinkled carpet of deep green and gold. Lakes dotted the landscape, their surfaces like shattered mirrors reflecting the gray sky. And cutting through it all, a serpentine ribbon of the most unnatural turquoise I'd ever seen, the Kenai River, glacier-fed and impossibly bright against the darker forest. "First time up here?" Dutch shouted over the engine noise. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes from the window. "It changes you," he said, something unreadable in his tone. "The real wilderness. Most people don't understand what that means until they're in it. No roads out, no cell service, no cavalry coming if things go south. Just you and whatever's out there." He glanced back at us, his expression serious. "You respect it, it'll be the best week of your life. You don't..." He shrugged and turned back to the controls. The flight took 40 minutes, following the river upstream as it narrowed, and the current grew more violent. The mountains rose around us, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Finally, Dutch banked the Beaver and began our descent, the engine pitch changing as we dropped toward a wide, relatively calm section of the river. The landing was surprisingly gentle, a series of soft bounces as the pontoons touched down. Then we were gliding across the water like a massive waterfowl, the spray creating temporary rainbows in the afternoon light. Dutch guided us toward the eastern shore, where a small wooden dock extended from the bank. And there it was, our home for the week. The cabin sat on stilts about 15 yards back from the river's edge, connected to the dock by a path of weathered planks. It was built from dark, heavy logs that looked like they'd been there forever, though Dad had told me the structure was only 20 years old. The roof was corrugated metal, green with lichen, a small covered porch wrapped around the front, facing the water. Behind it, the forest pressed close, a wall of spruce so thick I couldn't see more than a few yards into the shadows. Dutch helped us unload our gear onto the dock, moving with the hurried efficiency of someone who wanted to be gone before dark. "Cabin's stocked with firewood and basics," he said, handing Dad a laminated instruction sheet and a satellite phone in a waterproof case. "This is for emergencies only, and I mean emergencies. Battery's good for 2 calls, maybe 3. I'll be back in 7 days. Same time, same place, weather permitting." "What if the weather doesn't permit?" I asked, the question suddenly feeling important. Dutch gave me a long look. "Then I come when I can. Could be a day late. Could be 3. You've got enough supplies for 2 weeks if you're smart about it. You'll be fine." But something in the way he said it made me less than certain. We watched the Beaver taxi back out into the river, the engine roaring as Dutch gave it full throttle. The plane skipped across the water, lifted into the air, and banked away to the west. The sound of its engine faded gradually, then disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast silence of the wilderness. In that moment, standing on that dock with my father, I experienced true isolation for the first time in my life. The only sound was the constant rush of the river, a deep, powerful roar that I realized would never stop day or night for the entire week. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity or distant sirens, just water and wind and the occasional cry of a raven from the forest. "Come on," Dad said, grabbing his duffel. "Let's get settled before it gets dark." The cabin's interior was simple but functional. One large room with 2 sets of bunk beds against opposite walls. A heavy wooden table with 4 mismatched chairs. A cast-iron wood stove in the corner with a stockpile of split logs. And a small counter area with a basin for washing. The walls were covered with names and dates carved into the logs, decades of fishermen marking their stays. The windows were small and thick, the glass slightly warped with age. A kerosene lantern hung from a hook in the ceiling. We spent the next hour unpacking and organizing, tasks made easier by the comfortable silence that had always existed between us. Dad got the wood stove going, the heat quickly filling the small space and driving out the dampness. I organized our tackle and checked our rods, running my fingers along the lines, checking for weak spots. As the sun began to set, early this far north in September, we stood on the porch together, watching the river. The current was mesmerizing, the turquoise water moving with relentless power. I could see salmon occasionally breaking the surface, their dark shapes moving upstream on their final journey. "Tomorrow," Dad said, "we fish. Tonight we rest." We ate a simple dinner of canned stew heated on the stove, the metal spoons scraping against our tin bowls. The darkness outside was absolute. No light pollution, no moon visible through the clouds, just an impenetrable blackness pressed against the windows. The kerosene lantern cast dancing shadows on the log walls, making the carved names seem to move and shift. I climbed into my bunk, the sleeping bag surprisingly warm, and listened to Dad moving around the cabin in his methodical way, checking the door latch, adjusting the stove's damper, placing the satellite phone within easy reach on the table. Old habits from his army days, procedures that had kept him alive in places he never talked about. The last thing I remembered before sleep took me was the sound of the river, that constant rushing roar, and thinking how quickly a sound could go from impressive to comforting to just there. Background noise that my brain would learn to ignore. I should have paid more attention. I woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, scents that seemed almost magical in the wilderness. Gray light filtered through the small windows, and I could hear Dad moving around the cabin, the wood stove crackling with fresh fuel. Every muscle in my body felt stiff from the previous day's travel, but it was a good kind of soreness, the kind that promised adventure. "Morning," Dad said, not looking up from the cast iron skillet where thick slices of bacon sizzled and popped. "Weather cleared. Currents perfect. If we're smart, we'll limit out before lunch." I pulled myself from the warm cocoon of the sleeping bag and dressed quickly in layers. Thermal underwear, thick wool socks, a flannel shirt, and my weatherproof outer layer. The cabin was warm near the stove, but cold near the walls, condensation beating on the windows. Breakfast was simple and perfect. Bacon, scrambled eggs cooked in the bacon grease, and thick slices of bread toasted on the stove top. We ate quickly, eager to get on the water. Dad had already organized our gear on the porch, rods rigged with bright pink salmon flies, our waders hanging from nails, tackle boxes ready. Stepping outside was like entering a different world. The fog that had settled overnight was burning off, revealing the river in all its glory. The water looked even more impossibly turquoise in the morning light, and I could see salmon everywhere, dark torpedo shapes holding in the current, preparing for the next stage of their upstream battle. We pulled on our waders, the neoprene clinging to our legs, and Dad helped me check all the seams and straps. "Current strong," he warned. "You lose your footing, don't fight it. Float on your back, feet downstream, and work your way to the bank. Understand?" I nodded, having heard this lecture a dozen times before. But here, looking at the powerful flow of the Kenai, it felt less like a lecture and more like a lifeline of crucial information. We waded into the river together, and the cold hit me even through the waders, a shocking, numbing cold that made my breath catch. The current was immediately powerful, pushing against my legs with constant, patient force. Dad positioned himself upstream from me, his stance wide and solid, decades of experience showing in the way he read the water. "See there," he said, pointing to a seam where faster water met slower, creating a visible line on the surface. "That's where they rest. Cast upstream, let it drift through natural. Don't yank it. They'll take it or they won't." I made my first cast, the line unfurling awkwardly, landing with too much splash. Dad said nothing, just cast his own line with a smooth, practiced motion that made it look effortless. His fly landed exactly where he'd aimed, and within seconds his line went tight. "Fish on," he said calmly, and the battle began. Watching my father fight a salmon was like watching a master craftsman at work. He let the fish run when it needed to, reeled when he could, his rod bent into a perfect arc. The salmon jumped once, twice, its chrome and red body spectacular in the morning light. 5 minutes later, he guided it into the shallows where I scooped it up with the net, a beautiful male sockeye, maybe 10 pounds, its jaw already starting to develop the characteristic hook of spawning season. "Your turn," Dad said, already preparing his next cast. It took me 45 minutes to hook my first fish. When I finally felt that electric strike, that sudden explosion of weight and fury at the end of my line, every frustrating cast was forgotten. The fish fought like it was possessed, and in a way, it was. This was a creature that had traveled thousands of miles from the ocean, navigating by instincts older than human civilization, driven by a biological imperative to reach its spawning grounds. It wasn't going to give up easily. Dad coached me through it, his voice steady and calm. "Let it run good, now reel. Keep your rod tip up. That's it." When I finally guided it close enough for him to net, I was shaking partly from adrenaline, partly from the cold, partly from pure joy. We fished until noon, and by then we had our limit. 6 magnificent sockeyes between us, their bodies still silver bright, not yet showing the deep red coloring they'd develop as spawning approached. We strung them on a rope stringer and made our way back to shore, muscles burning from hours of standing against the current. Back at the cabin, Dad showed me how to properly clean the fish, making the cuts precisely, removing the guts and gills, filleting them with practiced efficiency. The flesh was a deep orange red, rich with the fats they'd stored for their upstream journey. We'd eat like kings. That afternoon, while Dad napped on his bunk, I explored the immediate area around the cabin. The forest was dense and primordial, the spruce trees towering overhead, their lower branches dead and bare. creating a layered canopy that blocked most of the light. The ground was soft with moss and fallen needles, dotted with mushrooms I couldn't identify. I found game trails, narrow paths worn through the undergrowth by deer or moose that disappeared into the darker reaches of the woods. Behind the cabin, maybe 30 yards into the forest, I found something that stopped me cold, a circle of stones, clearly arranged by human hands, surrounding the charred remnants of an old fire. But it wasn't a recent fire. The ash was long gone, the stones covered in moss and lichen. What disturbed me was what lay partially buried in the moss near the circle. Small carved sticks, each about 6 inches long, decorated with faded paint, and what looked like animal hair tied to their ends with strips of leather. I picked one up, examining it in the filtered light. The carving was intricate. Geometric patterns, and what might have been symbols, though I couldn't read them. The hair attached to it was coarse and dark, possibly moose or bear. It felt old, important, and somehow wrong for me to be touching it. A sound behind me made me drop it and spin around. Nothing was there. Just the forest, just the shadows between the trees, just the distant roar of the river. But my heart was hammering, and the back of my neck felt exposed, vulnerable. I backed away from the stone circle, not turning my back on it until I was nearly to the cabin. I didn't mention it to Dad when he woke up. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it felt like the kind of thing that would worry him. Or maybe because I was worried he'd dismiss it as nothing. Either way, I kept it to myself and helped him prepare dinner instead. That evening's meal was transcendent. Fresh salmon fillets pan-fried in butter until the skin was crispy and the flesh flaked at the touch of a fork, served with instant mashed potatoes and canned green beans that somehow tasted gourmet in that setting. Dad let me have a sip from his flask of whiskey, better whiskey than he usually drank, something he'd saved for the trip. The burn of it mixing with the taste of the salmon created a sense of peace I wanted to bottle and keep forever. As darkness fell and we settled into our bunks, I felt more content than I had in years. The day had been perfect. The kind of day that justified all the planning, all the expense, all the effort. Tomorrow we'd fish again, and the day after that, and the day after that. A week of this stretched ahead of us, and I couldn't imagine anything better. I fell asleep to the sound of the river and my father's steady breathing, completely unaware that this was the last normal night we'd have. I came awake slowly, pulled from deep sleep by something my brain couldn't immediately identify. The cabin was dark, the kind of absolute darkness that only exists in true wilderness, where the nearest electric light is miles away and the stars are hidden by clouds. The wood stove had burned down to embers, giving off barely enough light to see the vague shapes of furniture. The sound that had woken me came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint but distinct, coming from the wall behind my bunk, the wall that faced the river. My first drowsy thought was that a branch from the Sitka spruce near that side of the cabin must be knocking against the logs. We'd had a similar problem at home once, a maple branch that scraped against my bedroom window on windy nights. I lay there listening, waiting for the irregular randomness of wind-blown wood, but it didn't come. The tapping continued with metronomic precision. 3 taps, a pause of exactly the same length. Then 3 more taps, no variation, no change in intensity, just that steady, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Something about that consistency sent a shiver through me despite the warmth of my sleeping bag. I sat up, my eyes adjusting slightly to the darkness. Across the cabin I could make out my father's form in his own bunk. He was sitting up too, his head cocked toward the wall, listening. "You hear it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the constant rush of the river outside. "Yeah," I whispered back. "It's just a branch, right?" The tapping came again, perfectly timed, perfectly spaced. Tap. Dad didn't answer immediately. He slipped out of his bunk with the silent grace of someone who'd spent years learning to move without making noise. He crossed to the door in his thermal underwear and socks, lifted the heavy iron latch as quietly as he could, and pulled the door open just a few inches. Cold air flooded in, along with wisps of fog, thick white fog that pressed against the opening like something solid. The tapping stopped the instant the door opened. Dad stood there for a long moment, looking out into the white nothing. Then he stepped onto the porch in his socks, and I heard him walking around the perimeter of the cabin, his footsteps creaking on the wooden planks. He was gone for maybe 2 minutes before he came back inside, closing and latching the door behind him, Nothing, he said quietly. No branches touching the cabin. No wind at all. The air's completely still. Then what? I don't know. He went to the wood stove and added a log, nudging it into place with the poker. Orange light flared briefly, pushing back the darkness. Could be the wood settling. These old cabins make all kinds of noises. But he didn't sound convinced, and I noticed he didn't go back to his bunk immediately. Instead, he sat at the table, looking at the wall where the tapping had come from, the kerosene lantern in his hand, unlit but ready. We waited in silence for 20 minutes. The tapping didn't resume. Eventually, Dad returned to his bunk, and I lay back down, but sleep took a long time to return. Every small sound the cabin made, a pop from the stove, a creak from the settling structure, brought me back to full alertness. When I finally did sleep, my dreams were fragmented and strange, filled with sounds I couldn't identify and presences I couldn't see. The next day was overcast but dry. The river's turquoise color slightly muted under the gray sky. We fished for a few hours in the morning, catching 3 more sockeyes to supplement our supply. The fishing was good, but something felt different. Or maybe it was just me, unable to shake the memory of that methodical tapping. Dad seemed his normal self, methodical and patient in the water, offering tips on my casting technique, telling old stories about fishing with his own father in Montana when he was my age. But I noticed small things, the way his eyes occasionally flicked to the tree line, the way he positioned us so his back was never completely to the forest, the way he stayed closer to me than usual. That afternoon, while Dad cleaned fish on the porch, I decided to explore the riverbank in the opposite direction from yesterday's walk. The fog from the night before had left everything damp and dripping. The moss-covered rocks along the shore were treacherous, and I had to watch every step. I'd walked maybe a quarter mile when I found the footprints. They were in a patch of silt near the water's edge, exposed by the river's constant small fluctuations in level. At first, I thought they were human. They had the right general shape, the right size, but as I knelt down to examine them more closely, the differences became impossible to ignore. The prints were elongated, at least 16 inches from heel to toe. The toes, there were 4 of them, not 5, were splayed wide and ended in what looked like claw marks. The heel was deep, suggesting something very heavy, and they were fresh, the edges still sharply defined, not yet softened by seeping water. They led from the forest, crossed the patch of silt, and disappeared into the river. Whatever had made them had entered the water and hadn't come back out, at least not here. I stood up, suddenly very aware of how far I was from the cabin, how alone I was. The forest behind me felt watchful, oppressive. Every shadow between the trees could have been hiding something. I looked at the tracks again, trying to find a rational explanation. A bear? The toes were wrong. A moose? The shape was too human. I took a picture with the small waterproof camera Dad had brought, not because I thought anyone would believe me, but because I needed proof for myself that I hadn't imagined it. Then I headed back to the cabin, walking faster than I probably should have on the slippery rocks, resisting the urge to run. Dad was sitting on the porch drinking coffee from a tin cup. "You okay?" he asked, reading something in my expression. "You look spooked." I told him about the footprints, trying to describe them accurately without sounding hysterical. He listened without interrupting, his face neutral, that practiced military neutrality that meant he was processing information and deciding how to respond. "Could be something," he finally said. "Could be nothing. Bear tracks can look strange in soft ground, especially if they're partially washed out. These weren't bear tracks." He looked at me for a long moment. "Okay, show me tomorrow in good light. For now, stay close to the cabin. Don't wander off alone." The authority in his voice left no room for argument. This wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, the kind he'd probably given to soldiers under his command. That night, the fog returned thicker than before. It rolled up from the river like a living thing, swallowing the dock, the shore, the trees, until the cabin was an island in a sea of white. The temperature dropped, and Dad fed the wood stove constantly, keeping the interior warm while moisture beaded on the cold windows. We played cards at the table, cribbage with an old deck that had been left in the cabin. Dad won 3 games in a row, and I suspected he was letting me win the 4th when the tapping started again. Tap, tap, same wall, same rhythm, same inexplicable precision. This time, neither of us said anything. Dad carefully set down his cards and walked to the wall, pressing his palm flat against the logs. The tapping continued, seemingly unaffected by his touch. He moved his hand along the wall, following the sound, and when he reached the corner where the wall met the ceiling, the tapping moved too, flowing across the ceiling in a rapid series of strikes that crossed directly overhead. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. The tapping descended the opposite wall, reached the corner near the floor and stopped. Absolute silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant roar of the river. That was inside the walls, I said, my voice barely steady. Or something outside that knows exactly where we are, Dad replied. Neither explanation was comforting. We stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning, sitting at that table, a lantern lit between us, neither of us willing to be the first to suggest sleep. The tapping didn't return, but something worse took its place. A complete awareness that we were being observed, measured, studied by something we couldn't see and didn't understand. When we finally did go to our bunks, Dad placed his hunting knife on the small shelf next to his bed, a violation of one of his own rules about weapons in sleeping quarters. And I noticed he slept fully clothed, boots unlaced but on his feet. I lay awake for hours, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to every sound the cabin made, wondering what would happen when the tapping returned, because I was certain now that it would. This wasn't random, this wasn't coincidence. Something knew we were here, and it was announcing its presence in the only language it had. Morning brought rain, a steady cold drizzle that turned the river into a pattern of expanding rings, and made fishing seem like a miserable proposition. But Dad insisted we go out anyway. Can't let the weather run our week, he said, though I suspected he just didn't want us sitting in the cabin, waiting for nightfall and whatever would come with it. We suited up in our waterproof gear and waded into the river, the rain drumming on the hoods of our jackets. The salmon were still there, still moving upstream with single-minded determination, but they weren't biting. We spent 3 frustrating hours casting into the current with nothing to show for it. Let's try the gravel bar downstream, Dad finally suggested. Sometimes they hold in the slower water during rain. The gravel bar was about a quarter-mile downriver, a wide, shallow area where the river spread out and the current eased. We'd seen it from the Beaver when we'd flown in, a long stretch of gray stones that extended maybe 50 yards into the river. We picked our way along the rocky shore, carefully watching our footing on the slick stones. The rain had gotten harder, limiting visibility to maybe 30 yards. Everything beyond that was gray sheets of water blending into gray fog, blending into gray sky. The gravel bar was deserted, as I'd expected. We spread out, Dad working the upstream side while I moved to where the bar met the deeper channel. I let my fly drift into the faster water, watching my line, trying to feel for the subtle take of a salmon testing my offering. On my 3rd cast, I snagged something. The line went tight, but there was no fight, no pull, just dead weight. I reeled in slowly, carefully, ready to break off if I'd hooked a submerged log. But as I pulled, whatever it was came free easily, and I was able to guide it to the surface. It wasn't a log. At first, I thought it was just an unusually shaped piece of driftwood. But as I grabbed it and pulled it from the water, the reality of what I was holding sent a shock of revulsion through me that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a lure, but not like any fishing lure I'd ever seen. The body was carved from bone, yellowed, aged, porous bone that might have been human for all I could tell. It was about 5 inches long, carved into a crude fish shape with sharp angular features. The line wasn't modern monofilament. It was a thick braided cord that looked like it had been made from dried sinew or gut, stiff and waxy to the touch. But the hook, God, the hook was what made my hands start shaking. It wasn't metal. It was a single shard of black stone, maybe obsidian, napped to a viciously sharp point like an arrowhead. It was lashed to the bone body with more of the sinew cord, the binding intricate and purposeful. The entire thing was heavy, brutally functional, and wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. "Dad," I called out, my voice tight. "Dad, you need to see this." He waded over, and I held out the lure. His expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: curiosity, confusion, recognition, and finally something that looked like genuine fear. He took it from me, turning it over in his hands, examining the knots, the carving, the sharp obsidian point. His jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "How old is this thing?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. This isn't sport fishing gear. What is it?" He looked at me, then at the lure, then at the river stretching out around us into the fog. "This is subsistence gear. Indigenous, very old, probably pre-contact. You'd use something like this for survival fishing, not recreation. It's museum quality. Why would it be here? Why would someone just lose it in the river?" "They wouldn't," Dad said slowly. "This isn't the kind of thing you lose. It's too valuable, took too long to make. You'd guard it with your life." "Then how?" "I don't know." He looked around at the fog-shrouded river, at the dark forest beyond the shore. "But I don't like it. I don't like this at all." He walked to the edge of the gravel bar, and to my surprise threw the lure hard out into the deep channel. It disappeared into the turquoise water without a sound. "Why'd you do that?" "Because I don't want it near us," he said, his voice harder than I'd heard it all trip. "Come on, we're done for today." The walk back to the cabin was silent and tense. Dad moved fast, and I had to work to keep up. He kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the tree line, his hand occasionally dropping to his belt where he'd clipped his hunting knife. Back at the cabin, we shed our wet gear on the porch and went inside. Dad immediately got the stove roaring and we changed into dry clothes. But the warmth didn't help. The cold I felt wasn't from the rain. It was from something else, something that had seeped into my bones the moment I'd pulled that bone lure from the water. "That thing we found," I said as we ate a joyless lunch of canned soup. "You said it was old. How old?" Dad was quiet for a long time, staring into his bowl. "The obsidian, the bone, the sinew cord, that's technology that goes back thousands of years. Indigenous peoples used tools like that long before Europeans arrived. But the condition of it, it looked old but not ancient, if that makes sense. The sinew was dry but not crumbling. The obsidian wasn't weathered. So someone's still using these. Out here?" "No," he said firmly. "The tribes in this area all use modern equipment now. Hell, they have better gear than we do. Nobody's been making tools like that for generations." "Then where did it come from?" "I don't know, and I don't want to know." He met my eyes. "Promise me something. If you see anything else like that, anything at all that seems off or wrong or out of place, you tell me immediately. And you don't touch it. Understood?" I nodded, but a question was nagging at me. "Dad, do you think the tapping and the lure are connected?" His expression confirmed what I already suspected. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I do. I think something's out there, and I think it knows we're here. What it wants or what it is, I have no goddamn idea. But we've got 4 more days until Dutch comes back, and I need you to stay alert and stay close." That afternoon, while the rain continued to fall, I caught Dad doing something I'd never seen him do before. He was going through his duffel bag, inventorying our supplies with military precision. Canned food, energy bars, water filtration tablets, emergency shelter, first aid kit, fire starters, batteries for the flashlights. He laid it all out on his bunk, counted it twice, and then carefully repacked it all within easy reach. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Making sure we're prepared," he said, "just in case." "In case of what?" He didn't answer, just continued his methodical inventory. But I understood. He was preparing for the possibility that we might need to leave the cabin quickly, that we might need to survive in the wilderness without the shelter's protection. He was preparing for things to go wrong in ways that hadn't seemed possible 3 days ago. As darkness approached and the rain finally stopped, the fog returned. Thicker, denser, more oppressive than any I'd seen before. It didn't roll in gradually. It appeared as if someone had flipped a switch, transforming the world outside our windows from gray visibility to absolute white nothing in the space of minutes. We sat at the table again, the lantern lit, cards in hand but unplayed. We were both just waiting now, waiting for the tapping to start, for the next move in this game we didn't understand and hadn't agreed to play. When the sun set, not that we could see it through the fog, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost began forming on the inside of the windows despite the heat from the stove. And in that moment of transition from day to night, both of us felt it simultaneously. A change in the air, a presence, a certainty that we were no longer alone. Dad stood up, walked to the window facing the river, and wiped away the frost with his palm. He stared out into the white darkness for a long moment, then went very still. "Oh, Jesus," he whispered. I jumped up and joined him at the window. "What? What do you see?" "Look at the river, in the middle. Just look." I pressed my face close to the cold glass, straining to see through the fog and darkness. At first there was nothing, just white and more white, and the faint sense of the river's movement. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A shape, tall, standing in the middle of the current where no person could possibly stand without being swept away, completely motionless, a dark silhouette against the slightly paler fog, and it was looking directly at us. We stood frozen at that window, our breath fogging the glass despite the cold already there, staring at the impossible figure in the water. It didn't move. It simply stood, a dark column in the river where the current should have been a raging force capable of knocking a grown man off his feet in seconds. "How is it standing there?" I whispered, afraid to speak at normal volume, as if the figure might hear us through the glass and fog. "I don't know," Dad breathed. As we watched, the shape raised one arm, slowly, deliberately. The movement was wrong somehow, the joint seeming to bend at an angle that human arms shouldn't achieve. In the darkness and fog, distances were impossible to judge, but my brain insisted the arm was too long, the body too tall and narrow. Then something flickered at the end of that extended arm, a quick whip-like motion too fast for my eyes to track. I heard a sound despite the barrier of the cabin walls, a sharp whistling crack like a bullwhip cutting through air. A split second later, the river exploded 20 yards downstream from the figure, and I caught a glimpse of something being pulled back through the water, something large and struggling, impaled on what looked like that obsidian hook trailing a line the same dull color as the sinew cord I'd held that afternoon. The figure pulled in its catch with smooth, practiced motions that spoke of countless repetitions, countless fish taken from this river over spans of time I couldn't conceive. It was fishing. This thing was fishing, and it was doing so with an expertise that dwarfed anything Dad and I could claim. "It's a fisherman," I said stupidly. "It's just a person fishing." "No," Dad said, his voice hollow. "Look at it. Really look." I forced myself to focus on the silhouette, despite every instinct screaming at me to look away, to close the curtains, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. The more I looked, the more the wrongness revealed itself. The proportions were off, the limbs too long and thin, the torso too narrow, the head an oblong shape that didn't fit the human skull pattern, and it stood with absolute stability and current that I knew from experience was moving at 6 or 7 miles per hour with the force of thousands of tons of water. As we watched, paralyzed by the impossibility of what we were seeing, the figure's head turned. It rotated with a slow, mechanical smoothness, the kind of motion you'd see in a security camera, not a living neck. It turned away from the river, away from its catch, and oriented directly toward our cabin, toward our window, toward us. I couldn't see features. The distance and darkness and fog made that impossible, but I felt the weight of its attention land on me like a physical thing, a pressure against my chest that made breathing difficult. It was looking at us. It knew we were there. And in that moment of recognition, something fundamental shifted. We weren't just observers anymore. We had been acknowledged. We had been noticed. We had been marked. Time seemed to stretch, elastic and wrong. The figure stood there, facing us, making no move but somehow communicating a message as clearly as if it had spoken. "This is my river. These are my fish. You are trespassing." Then, with that same unnatural smoothness, it turned its head back to the water, resumed its fishing stance and cast again. The line shot out with impossible flatness, no arc, no drop, just a straight projection that terminated in the river with another explosion of water and another struggling salmon. "Inside," Dad said suddenly, grabbing my shoulder and pulling me away from the window. Away from the glass. Now. He pulled the curtains closed on all the windows, moving quickly from one to the next, blocking out the view of the river and the thing that fished there. Then he went to his bunk and did something I'd only seen him do once before, when we'd driven through a particularly dangerous part of Anchorage late at night. He pulled out his pistol from its locked case, checked the magazine, chambered around, and set it on the table within easy reach. "Dad, you can't. I don't know what that is out there," he interrupted, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "But it's not right. It's not natural. And I don't know what it's going to do now that it's seen us. Maybe it's just, I don't know, a person? Someone who lives out here? A hermit or... Stop. He looked at me, and I saw real fear in his eyes for the first time in my life. That wasn't a person. You know it wasn't. I know it wasn't. Don't make excuses because the truth is too frightening. He was right. I did know. Some deep, ancient part of my brain, the part that had kept my ancestors alive when saber-toothed cats prowled the savannah, was screaming at me that what I'd just seen was a predator, something dangerous, something that existed outside the natural order I understood. We sat at that table for hours, neither of us speaking much, both of us jumping at every small sound from outside. The river's roar continued unchanged. Occasionally I heard what might have been the whistle crack of that line being cast, but I couldn't be sure. The wind picked up, making the cabin creak and groan. Around midnight the sound started. First came the tapping again, but this time it was louder, more aggressive, less like knocking, and more like the impacts of thrown stones. They hit the walls in a rapid staccato. Thud, thud, thud. Chew, thud, thud. The cabin shook with each impact. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beams. Then came a new sound from the direction of the river, that low, guttural clicking I'd heard in my nightmares since finding the bone lure. It was a rapid-fire percussion of hard objects striking together, but organic somehow, wet and thick. The sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely and vibrate directly into my skull. Click, 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 click. "What is that?" I asked, my voice higher than I wanted it to be. Dad had his pistol in his hand now, not pointing it at anything, just holding it. "I don't know, maybe." The clicking stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound that froze the blood in my veins. A long, slow scraping against the front door. It started at the top and dragged downward, the sound of something hard, stone or bone or claw scoring deep grooves into the wood. The scrape descended in an agonizingly slow line, and I could picture whatever was making it standing on the porch, running one of those impossibly long fingers down the door, testing its strength, measuring its resistance. The scraping reached the bottom of the door and stopped. Silence. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then the door shuddered in its frame as something on the other side applied tremendous force to the latch. The heavy iron bar we'd dropped into its brackets began to bend, actually bend, the metal groaning under pressure that should have been impossible. Wood splintered around the mounting points. One of the brackets pulled away from the log wall with a shriek of tortured metal. "Shit," Dad hissed. He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back of the cabin. "The window. We're going out the window." "What? Why?" "Because it wants us watching the door." He was already at the small window on the back wall, the one facing the forest instead of the river. He wrapped his hand in his thick wool shirt and punched through the glass, the sound of breaking glass barely audible over the assault on the door. He worked quickly, knocking out the remaining shards, clearing the frame. The door shuddered again, and this time I heard wood crack. Not the door itself, but the log wall around the frame. Whatever was out there had the strength to tear the entire door frame out of the wall. "Go now." Dad shoved me toward the window. I didn't think, didn't question. I grabbed my day pack already loaded with emergency supplies thanks to Dad's afternoon preparations, and dove through the window head first, hitting the wet ground outside with a painful thud that knocked the wind from my lungs. Dad came through right behind me, landing more gracefully, his pistol still in his hand, his own pack on his back. Behind us, I heard the front door explode inward with a tremendous crash. Something entered the cabin. I heard its weight on the floorboards, heard it moving through the small space with disturbing confidence. "Run," Dad said. "Into the trees. Stay quiet, but move fast." We ran into the black maw of the forest, leaving behind the only shelter for miles, fleeing into a wilderness we didn't know from something we couldn't understand. Behind us, through the broken window, I heard the thing inside the cabin. It was searching, methodically checking each corner, each bunk, each hiding place. And when it didn't find us, a sound emerged from the cabin that I'll hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. A long rising howl that wasn't quite human, and wasn't quite animal. A sound of rage and frustration and hunger that echoed across the river valley, and sent every bird and creature in the forest into terrified silence. Then we heard it exit the cabin and the splashing started. Heavy rhythmic splashing from the river, moving parallel to our course through the trees, keeping pace with us despite the current, despite the cold, despite everything that should have made such pursuit impossible. We were being hunted. Running through an Alaskan forest in total darkness is a nightmare that defies description. Every step was a gamble, my boots landing on solid ground or sinking into hidden bogs, colliding with unseen logs, catching on trailing roots. Low branches whipped at my face, drawing blood I couldn't see. The Devil's Club, that cursed plant with its hundreds of needle-sharp spines, seemed to be everywhere, tearing at my clothes, puncturing my hands when I tried to push it aside. Behind us and to our left, the splashing continued its relentless rhythm. Whatever was in that river wasn't just following us, it was herding us, pushing us deeper into the forest, away from the river, away from any possible help. Dad led the way, his hand gripping my jacket to keep us together. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd navigated hostile terrain before, checking his compass every few minutes by the faint glow of a shielded penlight, always keeping us moving roughly parallel to the river but deep enough in the trees that we weren't visible from the water. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Dad pulled me down behind a massive fallen spruce. We crouched there, gasping for breath, listening. The splashing had stopped. The forest around us was eerily silent. No birds, no small animals, nothing. It was the silence of prey hiding, hoping the predator would pass by without noticing. "We need a plan," Dad whispered directly into my ear, his breath hot against my cold skin. "We can't just run blind all night." "The ranger station," I whispered back, remembering the map he'd studied before the trip. "You said there was a patrol cabin upriver. How far?" 15, maybe 20 miles as the crow flies. Double that through this terrain. 2, maybe 3 days if we push hard. Can we make it? His pause told me everything I needed to know. I don't know, that's a long way with that thing hunting us. As if summoned by our mention of it, the clicking started again, that wet guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was closer now, no longer confined to the river. It was in the forest with us. Dad pulled out his pistol, his hand steady despite the cold and fear. "If it finds us, I'll try to buy you time. You run. Due east, away from the river. Don't stop. Don't look back. Head for higher ground and wait until daylight, then head north. Understand? I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are." His voice carried absolute authority. "I didn't survive 20 years in the army and raise you alone to watch you die in these woods. If it comes to that, you run. That's an order." Before I could argue, a new sound cut through the forest. A heavy dragging noise, accompanied by the snap and crack of breaking branches. Something large was moving through the undergrowth. Not attempting stealth, simply pushing through obstacles with overwhelming force. And it was moving in our direction with the certainty of something that knew exactly where we were. "Move," Dad hissed, pulling me up. We ran again, no longer trying for silence, just speed. The dragging sound pursued us, sometimes falling behind, sometimes drawing frighteningly close. I risked a glance back once and immediately wished I hadn't. There was something back there, a darker shadow among shadows, moving wrong, too tall, too thin, pulling itself between trees with those impossibly long arms. The forest began to thin slightly, and we broke out into a small clearing, maybe 30 yards across. A bog occupied most of it, the surface water reflecting the faint starlight that penetrated gaps in the cloud cover. Dad started to lead us around the edge, but the splashing from the river suddenly resumed, cutting off that direction. We were being driven toward the bog deliberately. "Stop," Dad said, pulling up short. "This is a trap. It's pushing us toward the water. What do we do?" He spun in a slow circle, assessing our options. All of them bad. Forest on 3 sides, bog in the middle, and the sounds of pursuit closing in from multiple directions. We'd been cornered. "The tree," he said suddenly, pointing to a massive spruce at the edge of the clearing. "We go up, now." We ran to the tree, and Dad boosted me to the lowest branch, maybe 8 feet up. I pulled myself up with arms that burned from exertion, then reached down to help Dad. He jumped, caught my hand, and I hauled with everything I had. He scrambled up beside me, and we immediately started climbing higher, moving from branch to branch, gaining altitude. We were maybe 20 feet up when it entered the clearing. The fog had thinned enough that we could see it clearly for the first time, and the sight made my stomach twist with visceral horror. It stood at least 8 feet tall but was so emaciated it looked like a skeleton wrapped in wet dark skin. Its limbs were disproportionately long, arms that hung past its knees, fingers that seemed to have too many joints. The head was oblong, like I'd seen in silhouette, but up close I could make out a face of sorts, sunken pits where eyes should be. A lipless mouth full of teeth that looked more like the crushing plates of a pike than human dentition. It was naked except for what looked like wrappings of animal hide around its waist, and its skin, if it was skin, seemed to move and ripple like water, never quite staying solid. But the worst part was how it moved. It walked on 2 legs like a human, but the gait was all wrong. A lurching, disjointed motion where each leg seemed to move independently as if it was remembering how to walk rather than doing it naturally. Water dripped constantly from its body, leaving a trail of puddles behind it. It entered the clearing and stopped, its head swiveling on that too thin neck, scanning the area. We pressed ourselves against the trunk, trying to become invisible, barely breathing. Its head tilted back, that eyeless face turning upward, and I knew with horrible certainty that it was looking right at us. It raised one impossibly long arm, and I saw the lure clearly now, the bone and obsidian weapon trailing its sinew line. With a motion too fast to follow, it cast upward. The obsidian shard whistled past my head, missing by inches, embedding itself in a branch 6 feet above us. The thing pulled the line taut, testing the strength of its anchor. "It's going to climb," I whispered in horror. Dad raised his pistol, steadied it against a branch, and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The muzzle flashes lit up the night like lightning, and the reports were deafeningly loud in the quiet forest. I saw at least 2 shots hit the thing's torso. I actually saw the impacts, saw dark liquid spray from the wounds. It staggered back 1 step, 2 steps. Then it looked down at the wounds, tilted its head as if curious, and reached up to touch the holes in its chest. When it looked back up at us, its mouth opened impossibly wide, and that clicking sound emerged, louder now, angrier, vibrating through the air like a physical assault. The shots hadn't even slowed it down. Dad fired his remaining shots, 4 more rounds that all found their target, stitching a line across the thing's torso, and once in that oblong head, the headshot snapped its skull back, and for a moment I thought he'd killed it, but it simply straightened, shook itself like a dog shedding water, and resumed its approach to the tree. "Oh God," Dad breathed. "Oh God, it's not stopping." The thing reached the base of our tree and wrapped those long fingers around the trunk. It began to climb with disturbing speed and grace, pulling itself up, hand over hand, its 2 long limbs giving it an enormous advantage in reach. It was going to reach us in seconds. "Higher," Dad shouted, and we scrambled upward, moving from branch to branch as fast as we dared. But the branches were getting thinner, less able to support our weight. I felt 1 crack under my foot and barely caught myself from falling. The thing was 15 feet below us. 10 feet. 5. Dad pulled out his hunting knife, the blade gleaming in the starlight. When the thing reached for the branch I was on, he brought the knife down with all his strength, driving it through the thing's hand and into the wood beneath. The creature made a sound I can't describe, part hiss, part scream, like steam escaping from a vent, dark liquid that might have been blood sprayed from the wound. It pulled back, yanking the knife from Dad's grip, the blade still embedded in its hand. But the momentary retreat gave us time to climb higher, reaching branches that were barely thick enough to hold a person. Below us, the thing worked the knife free from its hand and dropped it to the ground. Then it looked up at us again, and I swear it was calculating, figuring angles, assessing weight limits, planning its next move with an intelligence that was more terrifying than simple animal cunning. It moved to a different side of the tree and started climbing again, choosing a route with stronger branches. We couldn't go any higher. The branches above us wouldn't support our weight. We were trapped. Dad fumbled in his pack and pulled out his emergency flare gun, a single-shot device loaded with a phosphorus flare designed to be seen from miles away. "Cover your eyes," he said. He aimed down and fired. The flare ignited with a whoosh of chemical fire, shooting downward in a streak of brilliant white light. It hit the thing in the chest and exploded, burning with an intensity that turned night into day. The creature shrieked, actually shrieked, a sound of genuine pain, and lost its grip, falling the 20 feet to the ground and landing with a heavy splash in the edge of the bog. It rolled in the water, trying to extinguish the phosphorus that was burning into its flesh. but the chemical fire continued to burn even underwater. We watched as it thrashed, smashing through the bog water, leaving a trail of that glowing white fire that spread across the surface like burning oil. Finally, it dragged itself out of the bog on the far side and retreated into the forest, still trailing wisps of white smoke from the wound, still making that horrible clicking, hissing sound. We watched it disappear into the trees, and only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath so long my vision was starting to tunnel. "Is it dead?" I gasped. "I don't think we can kill it," Dad said, his voice shaking. "But maybe we hurt it enough to make it think twice. Come on. We need to move while it's recovering. This is our only chance." We climbed down as quickly as we could, dropped the last 6 feet to the ground and ran. We ran like I've never run before, crashing through the forest, abandoning any pretense of stealth in favor of distance. Behind us, very faint now, I could still hear that clicking, but it wasn't pursuing. Not yet. We ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs felt like they were full of broken glass, until the pre-dawn light began to filter through the trees, and we both collapsed in a heap next to a fallen log, gasping, bleeding, soaked with sweat and bog water, but alive. Alive. For now, the morning light revealed the full horror of our situation. We were lost in one of the largest wilderness areas in North America, at least 15 miles from the nearest human habitation, pursued by something that couldn't die and wouldn't quit. My hands were torn and bleeding from the rough bark and devil's club thorns. Dad's face was gray with exhaustion, making him look 10 years older than he had 2 days ago. We were both soaked through, and the morning temperature was barely above freezing. Dad pulled out his compass and map, studying them with red-rimmed eyes. "We're here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map that looked like every other spot, just green, indicating forest, blue indicating river. "The ranger station is here, about 16 miles northeast. 2 days of hard hiking in good conditions. 3 or 4 given." He gestured at our condition and the inhospitable terrain. "Will it follow us in daylight?" I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice. "I don't know, but I don't want to wait around to find out." We rationed our emergency supplies carefully. Energy bars that tasted like sawdust, water that we filtered from a small stream using the pump Dad had thankfully packed. We had enough food for maybe 3 days if we were careful, but that was assuming we could make 3 days. The morning was overcast, threatening more rain. We set off northeast, following game trails when we could find them, bushwhacking through alder thickets when we couldn't. Dad checked his compass every 10 minutes religiously, never trusting his sense of direction, always verifying. It was one of his survival rules: the wilderness wants you to get lost, never give it the satisfaction. Around midday, we found evidence that we weren't the only ones who'd traveled this route. Carved into a massive birch tree, about 6 feet off the ground, were symbols I couldn't read. Geometric patterns and shapes that looked similar to what I'd seen on those carved sticks near our cabin. Below them, a single word in English, carved more recently, the letters still showing lighter wood: "Turn back." "Someone tried to warn people," I said. Dad studied the carving. "These symbols are Denoina, indigenous warning signs. This whole area might have been considered sacred or forbidden." He looked around at the forest, at the dark spaces between the trees. Maybe they had good reason. We kept moving, but the discovery sat heavy in my gut. How many others had come to this part of the river? How many had seen what we'd seen? And how many had made it out to tell about it? The afternoon brought the rain. Dad had predicted a cold, relentless drizzle that soaked through our clothes and made every step miserable. The temperature dropped further and I began to shiver uncontrollably. Dad noticed and made us stop long enough to put on every layer we had, but it barely helped. We were burning calories faster than we could replace them, fighting cold and exertion and fear. As the light began to fail early this far north in September, we started looking for a place to spend the night. Dad wanted somewhere defensible, somewhere we could hear anything approaching, somewhere we could see without being seen. We found a small rock outcropping that offered a slight overhang, enough to keep the worst of the rain off us. We crawled underneath, exhausted, and Dad unpacked our minimal sleeping gear. "No fire," he said before I could ask. "Light attracts attention. We stay cold but hidden." We huddled together under a single emergency blanket, the metallic fabric rustling with every movement, sharing body heat. We took turns staying awake, 2-hour watches that Dad timed by his watch. He took the first watch while I tried to sleep. But sleep was elusive. Every sound, every drip of water, every crack of a branch brought me to full alertness, my heart hammering. Around midnight during my watch I heard it, splashing. Distant but unmistakable. It was in the river again, and the river ran less than a quarter mile to our west. We'd gotten too close to the water, or it had cast a wider net in its search. Either way, it had found our trail again. I shook Dad awake. "It's back," I whispered. He listened, his face grim in the darkness. "How far?" "The river. Maybe 10 minutes away if it comes straight at us." He was already packing our gear with shaking hands. "We move, now, east, away from the water, as fast and quiet as we can." We abandoned the shelter and plunged back into the forest, moving through the darkness more by feel than sight. Behind us the splashing stopped, replaced by that dragging sound I'd heard the previous night, the sound of something pulling itself from the water onto land. We moved through a waking nightmare, a slow-motion chase through ink-black forest where every step might be our last. The dragging sound followed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. It was playing with us, I realized. It could have caught us at any time but was choosing to prolong the hunt, to savor our fear. Dawn found us crossing a wide gravel stream bed, tributary to the main river. We were both stumbling now, running on pure adrenaline and the survival instinct. Dad kept checking his compass, kept us moving northeast, but I could see he was reaching his limit. We both were. "How much farther?" I asked, my voice a rasp from dehydration and exhaustion. Dad checked the map again, measuring distances with his thumb. 5 miles, maybe 6. 3 or 4 hours if we can keep this pace. We couldn't keep the pace. By mid-morning we were barely walking, each step a deliberate act of will. The dragging sound had faded, but I didn't trust its absence. It was out there somewhere, I was certain, watching, waiting. And then miraculously we broke out of the tree line onto a gravel road, barely more than a track, but definitely man-made. It stretched north and south, and I could have cried at the sight of it. "The patrol road," Dad said, his voice cracking with relief. "We're close. The ranger station is north, maybe 2 miles." We stumbled along the road, moving faster on the even surface, hope beginning to override exhaustion. A mile passed, then another, and then through the trees ahead, I saw it, a small log cabin with a green metal roof and a thin line of smoke rising from a stone chimney. Civilization. Help. Safety. We staggered the last 100 yards and collapsed on the cabin's porch, our legs finally giving out completely. The door opened, and a man stood there. Late 50s, weathered face, calm eyes that took in our battered condition without shock. "Get inside," he said simply. "You look like hell." The ranger's cabin was small but felt like a palace after 2 nights in the wilderness. A wood stove radiated blessed warmth, and the man who introduced himself as Tom Wheeler wrapped us in thick wool blankets and set steaming mugs of sweet tea in our trembling hands. He moved with quiet efficiency, asking no questions, just taking care of the immediate needs: warmth, water, food. Only after we'd stopped shivering and had eaten 2 bowls each of thick beef stew did he finally sit down across from us at the small wooden table. "You two are several days overdue on your flyout," he said calmly. "Dispatch got a call from your pilot 3 days ago. We've been keeping an eye out." Dad nodded, his hands wrapped around his 3rd mug of tea. "We had some trouble at the cabin." Wheeler's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. "What kind of trouble?" And so Dad told the story. He spoke in his precise military way, reporting facts without embellishment. The tapping on the walls, the bone lure, the figure in the river, the assault on the cabin, the 2-day flight through the forest. He left nothing out, including the shooting, including the flare, including our absolute certainty that what had hunted us wasn't human and couldn't be killed by conventional means. I watched Wheeler's face during the recitation, expecting skepticism or pity, or the careful expression people get when they think they're dealing with someone who's lost their mind. But none of that appeared. He just listened, nodding occasionally, his expression growing more somber as the story progressed. When Dad finished, Wheeler was silent for a long time. Then he got up, walked to a bookshelf cluttered with field guides and old paperbacks, and pulled down a worn leather journal with a stained cover. He handled it carefully, like it was fragile or precious or both. "I've been stationed on this river for 30 years, he said, returning to the table. "I've seen things, heard things. Most of it you explain away. Bear, moose, the cold playing tricks on your mind, but not all of it." He opened the journal to a marked page. There, in faded pencil, was a sketch that made my breath catch. It was the thing we'd seen, rendered in careful detail, the proportions, the elongated limbs, the oblong head. Below it were notes in tight handwriting, and what looked like copies of much older drawings, crude but unmistakable representations of the same creature. "The Denana people who've lived here for thousands of years have stories about the Nantina," Wheeler said, his finger tracing the sketch. "Rough translation: the river man, or the river guardian. They say he's not a ghost or spirit in the way we think of them. He's something else, something that's part of the river itself, as old as the water and the salmon runs. He guards the best fishing grounds. He doesn't like competition, and he doesn't like trespassers." "Can he be killed?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Wheeler shook his head slowly. "According to the stories, no. Not in any permanent way. He can be hurt, driven off, but he always comes back. He's territorial. The elders say he claims certain stretches of the river as his own, and anyone who fishes there without permission, respect, the right offerings, they risk his attention." "Why didn't anyone warn us?" Dad asked, his voice harder than I'd heard it since the cabin. "Because nobody believes in old stories anymore," Wheeler said simply. "Modern people come up here thinking the wilderness is just scenery, something pretty to look at while they catch their limit. They don't understand that this land has its own rules, its own powers, its own residents. And by the time they find out different, they're either running for their lives or they're not running at all." He closed the journal carefully. "You're lucky. Very lucky. I've pulled 3 bodies from this river over the years, and investigated 2 disappearances that never got solved. All of them were fishermen who'd gone into remote areas. All of them were in his territory. We write it up as drowning, or bear attacks, or exposure. Because what else can we write? Nobody wants to hear about the rivermen. So what do we do?" I asked. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen." Wheeler looked at me with something like sympathy. "That's exactly what you do. You tell people you got turned around in the fog, got spooked by a bear. Whatever story makes sense. Because if you tell them the truth, they'll think you're crazy. The wilderness will eat that story the same way it eats everything that challenges the comfortable narrative that people like to believe." He stood up and went to his radio. "But right now I'm calling for an emergency evac. We'll say you suffered from exposure and needed medical attention. There's a helipad about a mile north. We can have you on a chopper to Anchorage in 2 hours." As he made the call, I looked at Dad. He looked back at me with eyes that had seen too much, that knew too much. Neither of us spoke, but an understanding passed between us. An acknowledgement of what we'd survived, what we'd witnessed, and what we could never fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. The helicopter ride to Anchorage was surreal. The noise of the rotors made conversation impossible, which was fine because I didn't want to talk. I just stared out the window at the endless expanse of forest passing below, at the ribbon of turquoise river, at the dark spaces between trees where anything might be hiding. We landed at a hospital, were checked over by doctors who found us exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in minor injuries but otherwise intact. They kept us overnight for observation, plying us with IV fluids and warm food, and questions about how we'd gotten so turned around. Dad stuck to Wheeler's script. We'd gotten lost in fog, panicked, fled from what we thought was a bear, and had spent 2 miserable days finding our way back to civilization. The doctors accepted the story because it made sense, because it fit their understanding of how the world worked. The next day, Mom's sister, my Aunt Susan, picked us up from the hospital. She fussed over us, made us promise never to go into the wilderness like that again, and drove us home to the small house we'd left less than a week ago. It felt like we'd been gone for months. Over the next few days, Dad and I didn't talk about what had happened. Not directly, but sometimes I'd catch him standing at the kitchen window staring at nothing, his hand unconsciously touching his chest where the thing's obsidian hook had nearly impaled him. Sometimes I'd wake in the night and hear him moving through the house, checking locks, looking out windows, unable to sleep. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, postmarked from Homer, Alaska. Inside was a single photo, the sketch from Wheeler's journal, Xeroxed but clearly reproduced. On the back, in handwriting I recognized as Wheeler's, was a single sentence. You showed respect by leaving. He won't follow you here. I showed it to Dad. He looked at it for a long time, then carefully folded it and put it in his wallet. We were lucky, he said quietly. A lot of people who go out there aren't. Do you think we'll ever go back? He looked at me, really looked at me, seeing not his 17-year-old son but his partner in survival, the person who'd run with him through hell and come out the other side. No, he said finally. There are some places that don't want us. Some places that belong to things older than we can imagine. We stumbled into his territory, and he gave us a chance to leave. Not everyone gets that chance. So we just forget about it? No. We remember it. We respect it. And we stay the hell away from the Upper Kenai. That was 4 years ago. I'm in college now, studying environmental science, learning about ecosystems and wilderness management, and the complicated relationship between humans and nature. I've been on camping trips, fishing trips, hiking expeditions. I love the outdoors, love the peace and challenge it offers. But I've never gone back to Alaska, and whenever I'm near water, any water from mountain streams to the ocean, I find myself scanning the depths, looking for shapes that shouldn't be there, listening for the whistling crack of a line being cast, watching for that oblong head breaking the surface. Because I know now what the wilderness truly is. It's not a playground or a resource or a scenic backdrop for Instagram photos. It's a place with its own rules, its own inhabitants, its own ancient balance that humans disrupt at their peril. The riverman taught me that, and sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. That wet guttural clicking, that sound of something impossibly old reminding me that there are places humans don't belong. And I got away with my life only because I was smart enough or lucky enough to run when he told me to. Some territories you don't trespass. Some waters you don't fish. Some things you don't challenge. And the Upper Kenai, that beautiful turquoise ribbon cutting through the wilderness, belongs to something far older and far more powerful than any fisherman with a rod and a dream of catching the big one. It belongs to him, and it always will.